The Vatican went quiet at the wrong hour. Not the quiet of a building at rest. Not the ordinary silence of stone corridors after Compline, after the last candle is extinguished and the last door closes on another Roman night. This was a different kind of quiet. The kind that has weight to it. The kind that fills a room before something irreversible happens inside it. It was 11:47 in the evening when the last of the 12 men crossed the threshold. The Swiss guards sealed the doors behind him. No photographers, no aides, no record of entry beyond a single handwritten log that would later be stored in a place no journalist has ever been permitted to reach. 12 cardinals. 1 pope. A room deliberately chosen because nobody used it after dark. What was said inside that room in the next 90 minutes has never been officially confirmed. No transcript was published. No aide took notes. No camera captured a single frame. And yet, within a week, the Vatican moved differently. Letters traveled faster. Signatures that used to require weeks appeared in days. Men who had been comfortable for years suddenly arrived at their offices early and left late, checking twice everything they had previously signed without reading. Something happened in that room. The evidence of it is everywhere. The explanation of it is what nobody was supposed to know. This is that explanation. To understand what occurred on that night, you have to go back 10 days. Back to the airport outside Luanda, Angola, where Pope Leo XIV stepped off a papal aircraft after 11 days across 4 African nations, with the particular tiredness that belongs to a man who has seen too much to pretend anymore that everything back home is fine. The journey had been the kind that changes a person. Not in the ways that people use that phrase carelessly, but in the specific, irreversible way that happens when you spend 11 days standing in the middle of realities that no briefing document can adequately prepare you for. He had walked through a prison in Equatorial Guinea, where inmates had been waiting 3 years for trials that no one was scheduling. He had stood in a courtyard in Cameroon in the early morning as children who had traveled 4 hours on foot arrived to see him, their shoes worn through in some cases to the bare sole, their faces carrying a particular combination of exhaustion and hope that he later told one aide he would never be able to stop seeing. He had celebrated Mass in a chapel in Algeria, where the roof had been patched with corrugated tin because there was no money for anything better, and where the congregation had sung with a fullness that the grandest basilicas in Rome had not produced in years. He returned to Rome exhausted in the body and alert in the spirit. It is a specific combination that tends to produce decisive action in people who are built for it. But it was not what he had seen in Africa that changed his mood on the flight home. It was what was waiting for him on his private desk somewhere over the Mediterranean. A red folder. No cover letter. No name on the label. Just 2 words printed in small type. Internal. Confidential. He opened it at cruising altitude. He finished reading it before the descent into Rome. And by the time the wheels touched the runway, the aide who came to escort him through the terminal would later say that the man who walked off that plane was visibly carrying something new. Not anger, exactly. Something colder and more concentrated than anger. Something that suggested a decision had already been made, and that the remaining question was simply one of method. The folder contained 23 pages. It documented, in precise and boring administrative language, what had been done to 3 of his central reform initiatives during the 11 days he had been preaching to prisoners and walking beside children in borrowed shoes. The first initiative was financial. He had ordered full independent audits of every Vatican department, conducted by lay professionals with no history inside the institution, no relationships to protect, no debts to repay. The kind of audit that produces honest numbers rather than comfortable ones. The second was structural. He had been working to redistribute genuine decision-making authority away from Rome and toward the bishops who were actually governing the church in the places where the church's most urgent work was happening. He had said it publicly in Yaoundé with the kind of directness that left no room for reinterpretation. A church that speaks only from Rome is not speaking to the world as it actually exists. The third was the one that had accumulated the most resistance in the years before his papacy and would continue to accumulate resistance in the years after. An accountability protocol for bishops who had covered up abuse. Real accountability. Not the kind that results in a quiet transfer to a smaller diocese. Public processes, named outcomes, records that stayed open. While he was in Africa, all three had been quietly, methodically, professionally softened. A memo here, a new clause inserted into an existing document there, a signature on a delay authorization that appeared routine unless you were looking for it, a reassignment processed through channels that made it look administrative rather than strategic. The 23 pages laid it out in sequence. Who had drafted what? Who had signed? Who had passed documents along without signing? Who had been in the room when decisions were made? Who had known and stayed silent? For 7 days after landing, Leo XIV said nothing about any of it. To his staff, this was unusual enough to be noted quietly, between themselves, in the cautious language that Vatican insiders use when they are worried about something they cannot yet name. The Pope was a direct man. He did not accumulate grievances. He addressed things. He moved forward. He did not wait. But this time, he waited. He attended his audiences with the public ease of a man who has nothing on his mind. He received the Archbishop of Canterbury and prayed with her in the Urban VIII chapel and spoke about the peace that holds even when structures fail it. He smiled at pilgrims in the square. He signed ordinary correspondence. In private, he was conducting a different kind of work entirely. One by one, without fanfare, without official scheduling, he called people in. The head of the Vatican Statistical Office, a layman he had known for decades from his years in South America, the kind of man whose honesty is a matter of biography rather than policy, the independent auditors he had appointed the previous summer. The head of the communications dicastery, brought in last and asked a single question that the man would later describe as the most direct conversation of his professional life. None of them spoke about what they had discussed. Each of them verified something specific. By the morning of the 30th, there was nothing in the 23 pages that had not been confirmed by at least 2 independent sources. One meeting in particular is worth dwelling on. A retired senior official, someone who had spent decades inside the Roman Curia under multiple pontificates, was asked to come at dawn. He arrived expecting a pastoral conversation, the kind that popes occasionally have with elderly veterans of institutional life, part courtesy, part history. Instead, he found 3 pages on the desk in front of him and a single question. "Have you seen this before?" The man read slowly. When he looked up, there were tears at the edges of his eyes. Not from sentimentality, from recognition. "Yes, Holy Father," he said, multiple times. Under different popes, the method is almost always the same. They wait for absence. Fatigue, a moment when the pontiff's attention is pointed elsewhere. Then they move. Small adjustments. Nothing that looks like rebellion, nothing that requires a public response. They make the institution feel like it was always this way. And the popes who recognized it, Leo asked. How did they respond? The old man looked at the floor. Most of them did not respond effectively, he said, because by the time they understood the pattern, they were already tired. The institution had outlasted their energy. Leo thanked him. After the door closed, he remained at his desk without moving for a long time. That afternoon, he walked alone in the gardens for nearly an hour, which his closest aide had never observed him do before. The aide, watching from a window, said later that it was the only time he had ever seen something in the Pope's posture that resembled the visible weight of anger. Not the explosive kind, but the kind that has been compressed into something deliberate and patient, and therefore more powerful than the explosive kind ever becomes. That evening, 12 phones received the same message. His Holiness requests your presence tonight. The 8 words carried no agenda, no explanation, no allowance for decline. The room they were led into was not the formal library. It was a side chamber, used occasionally for minor administrative purposes, lit that night at a level that was deliberately lower than normal, a choice that several of the 12 would later think about more than they expected to. A long table, 12 chairs along one side, one chair at the far end, empty. They stood. Nobody sat down first, because nobody wanted to be the first one sitting when the Pope entered. For 3 minutes they stood in a silence that one of them would later describe as the most uncomfortable 3 minutes of his career, which was saying something for men who had spent their lives in institutions where silence is a professional instrument. Then the door opened. Leo XIV entered alone. No aide, no secretary, no witness. He carried a red folder and a small black notebook. He set both on the table at his end of the room and looked at them. All 12 of them. Slowly. One face at a time. Long enough that each man understood he was being seen specifically, not generally. "Sit," he said. They sat. He did not. He held up a single page from the folder, the memo of April 16th. A single paragraph authorizing a 90-day delay on the lay financial audit. 4 signatures at the bottom. All 4 signatories present in the room. "I did not sign this," he said. "I was not asked. I was not informed. I was not consulted in any form. And yet a reform of this pontificate was pushed back 3 months while I was in Cameroon meeting children who had walked 4 hours to see their Pope." He set the page down. He pulled out the second page. "There are 8 more documents like this one," he said, and for the next 20 minutes he presented them one by one. Each one naming what had been done, when it had been done, and by whose authorization. He read the relevant sections without commentary, without escalation of voice, without theatrical pauses. The documents spoke in a register that needed no dramatization. Every new page landing on the table produced a slightly heavier silence than the page before it. By the time he reached the 8th document, the eldest of the 12 was trembling. By the 9th, another had lowered his head. Leo did not press them. He did not interpret their reactions. He simply continued until the folder was empty. Then he stood looking at them for a long moment, without speaking. 11 days, he said finally. 23 pages of decisions made in my name, without my knowledge, in my absence. He let that sentence settle. I know which of you initiated this. I know which of you carried it forward. I know which of you agreed without initiating. I know which of you passed documents you did not read. I know which of you were told to stay silent. And I know who told you. His voice remained at the same register throughout, not loud, not cold, exactly, but with the specific quality of certainty that does not need volume to be felt as force. I am not here for confessions, he said. I am not here to humiliate anyone in this room. I am not here for apology. He paused. I am here because this church will not be administered in the dark. Not in this pontificate. And not in any pontificate that builds on what this one establishes. He opened the small black notebook. He turned to a page and placed it facing them on the table. Each of the 12 could see, beside his own name, a single word written in the Pope's hand. Some of the words were warning. Some were review. 2 were removal. 1, belonging to a man who had spent the meeting assuming the worst about himself, said trust. The man beside the word trust did not feel relieved. He felt the specific disorientation of someone whose map of the situation has just been revised completely. Leo closed the notebook. Each of you will receive written communication by the end of this week, he said. Some of you will remain in your current roles. Some will be reassigned. Some will be asked to retire. Until you receive that communication, you will continue your duties without change. You will not contact one another about this meeting. You will not write to one another. You will not discuss it. He paused. If a word of what was said in this room appears in any press outlet, every person in this room will be reassigned that same day, without process, without appeal, without the courtesy of individual timing. He looked at the folder on the table. This folder stays with me. Copies exist in a location that none of you can access. If anything happens to the folder or to me, they will be released in full. The room became very still in a different way, because several of the men understood, in that moment, that they had not simply been confronted. They had been outmaneuvered. The Pope had not arrived at this meeting unprepared. He had arrived having already closed every exit. The question was no longer whether there would be consequences. The question was only what form each consequence would take. And then he said something that none of them had expected. He sat down. He folded his hands. He spoke without any of the administrative language that had structured the previous 30 minutes. "This church belongs to the people who have no power inside it," he said. "I sat in a prison in Equatorial Guinea with men who are waiting for trials no one intends to schedule. I stood in Angola in a chapel where the roof is held together with corrugated tin, and where the congregation sang with more conviction than I have heard in buildings that cost 100 million euros. I sat with women who have lost children and did not leave the church despite having every reason to. I sat with young people who did leave the church because they concluded that its leaders were primarily interested in protecting themselves." He looked at the eldest among them. "Every one of those people," he said, "deserves a church whose house is in order, not a church that governs by convenience, not a church that manages its failures as communications problems, not a church whose finances move through shadows because the light is inconvenient for the people managing them." He looked down at the table. "You told yourselves that you were protecting the institution." He paused. "You were protecting your positions inside it. I understand the difference. I am asking you to understand it too, and to be honest with yourselves about which one you were actually serving." The cardinal who had drafted the April 16th memo looked at the table. The Pope turned to him specifically, without naming him. "You may be right," he said, "that some reforms are moving faster than the institution can absorb. That is a legitimate concern. It is a concern I take seriously." He paused. "But the answer to that concern is a conversation, not a memo signed during my absence. If you believe I am moving recklessly, you have my door. You have always had my door. The reason you did not use it is not that I would not have listened. The reason is that you knew I would have disagreed. And you wanted to avoid disagreement rather than engage with it." He straightened. "That is not protection of the church. That is avoidance of accountability, and this institution has had enough avoidance of accountability to last several generations." He rose. He walked the length of the table slowly, not stopping, not leaning in, just moving past each of them in a silence that had its own particular weight. He reached the door. He turned. "One more thing," he said. He did not look at the whole group. He looked at a specific point in the middle of the table. "Tomorrow morning, I will announce the creation of a new internal compliance office. The person leading it will be named tomorrow. He is in this room. He will be given full access to every department, every account, and every communication channel in this institution. He will report to me directly, and to no one else." He held the door handle. "You came into this room as a group. You will leave it as 12 individuals. That is intentional." He paused. "Pray tonight, especially those of you for whom prayer has become a professional performance rather than a personal practice. It will help. Good night." He walked out. They sat in the room without speaking for 8 minutes after the door closed. Then the eldest rose and left, and one by one the others followed, not together, each man moving into the cold Roman night through his own exit, returning to his own apartment, to his own version of a sleepless night. What happened in the next 72 hours moved quickly and quietly, which is how the Vatican moves when it is serious about something. 4 retirement requests were submitted within 3 days. No reasons were given in writing. 2 reassignments were announced with the kind of brief official language that says everything by saying very little. 3 written warnings were delivered by hand to 3 residences on the same morning. The compliance office was announced by noon the following day, the appointment going to a cardinal whose career had been defined, simply and consistently, by the absence of scandal, and the reforms that had been softened during the 11 days in Africa were not restored. They were accelerated. The lay auditors arrived in Rome with unrestricted access and a 7-day deadline for every department to produce complete financial records. The accountability protocol was formalized as a binding papal document and released to the public. The structural redistribution was announced with the first 3 affected offices named explicitly. Inside the institution, the change was felt before it could be fully explained. The corridors moved faster. Documents that had waited weeks on desks began closing in days. People who had administered comfortable silence for years began checking their work twice. A young priest, walking through one of the main administrative offices late on a Thursday afternoon, said afterward that something in the building had simply altered, that the men who worked there seemed for the first time to understand themselves as accountable to something beyond the next internal negotiation. 3 separate senior figures, asked by junior colleagues what had changed, gave 3 different answers. One said, "He sees more than we assumed." One said, "We mistook his patience for permission." The third said nothing for a moment, then said quietly, almost to himself, "We thought his silence meant he was absent." That was the error. In his private apartment several days later, the Pope's morning aide delivered the daily briefing and noticed something on the desk beside the open notebook. A single sentence written in the Pope's hand at the top of a fresh page. Not a policy note. Not an administrative reminder. Something private, written perhaps in the early hours when the day had not yet made its demands. The Church will not hide any more. And below it, underlined, "Begin again tomorrow." The aide turned away quickly, understanding that some things are not meant to be read. But he remembered the words, because they stayed with him the way things stay with you when you have accidentally seen something true. The room in the Apostolic Palace returned to ordinary use within a week. The lights went back to their usual brightness. The table was used for minor meetings of no consequence. Nothing marked the walls. Nothing marked the floor. A Swiss guard who had been on duty that night and who had seen the 12 men arrive and the 12 men leave had no idea what had occurred inside. But the institution that surrounded that room was already different. Not loudly, not visibly to anyone looking from the outside, but in the specific, structural way that an institution becomes different when the people inside it understand, finally, that the person at the top is paying attention and will continue paying attention and cannot be waited out. The 12 men who had walked into that room as a coalition walked out as 12 individuals, each holding a different word written beside his name in a notebook he had only glimpsed for a moment. Each of them carrying that word forward into whatever came next. Each of them understanding, in the particular way that moments of genuine reckoning produce understanding, that something had ended and something had begun, and that the beginning was not going to be more comfortable than the ending had been. The Pope returned to his audiences the following morning. He smiled at pilgrims in the square. He signed letters. He received ambassadors. He prayed in public with the quietness of a man who prays in private the same way. The world saw nothing unusual. Inside the walls, everyone saw everything.